Many first-time readers of Melville's Moby Dick start losing interest around chapter 32. This is around the time where Ishmael's narrative, rather vibrant until this point, bogs down in the infamous Cetology chapter, where Ishmael attempts to classify all the various kinds of whales. And for many readers, this is chalk dry boring, and often they do not make it beyond this chapter. To me, it's one of the most important chapters in the entire novel. Even though it doesn't have much narrative use, it has tremendous interpretive use for us as readers of Moby Dick. It's important to note that this chapter is about classification, yes, but ultimately it's about the impossibility of classification. That there are too many kinds of whales to classify accurately, and also that the whale types blur into each other. So in some cases, you can't tell the difference between one species of whale and another. So the Cetology chapter is a parody of scientific classification. And what is scientific classification but a conceptual map of the natural world that allows us to make meaningful distinctions and to make meaningful predictions? But what if this map is not in harmony with the territory? What if there's an irreducible gap between map and territory? Well, we can easily extend this thinking analogically to language itself. That language itself is a classification system. It's a map that attempts to explain to us a territory. But what if word and thing are irreducibly distant from one another? What then? What does that do to our sense of language? When we talk about the world, what are we really talking about? If our language cannot get to that world, if our language cannot capture that world, then what are our words referring to? Well, Ishmael has this in mind, this idea of language as a faulty system, when he gets to the end of the famous Cetology chapter. And here's what he says. Now I'll leave my cetological system, standing thus unfinished, even as the great cathedral of Cologne was left, with the crane still standing upon the top of the uncompleted tower. For small erections may be finished by their first architects. Grand ones ever leave the copstone to posterity. God keep me from ever completing anything. This whole book is but a drought, nay, but the drought of a drought. Old time, strength, cash, and patience. So I talked about failure in another lecture. This is a perfect example of the aesthetic failure that Melville is employing throughout this novel. Only tiny projects can be finished, but great projects, sublime projects, can never be finished. And this is a good thing. The failure to complete ultimately opens one up into the empty spaces that are left because they're not being covered by the building that's imagined. If I look at a fragment of a building, what do I immediately do? I try to fill out the empty space. But ultimately, because it is empty space, I can't decide exactly what that building's supposed to be. I have my vision of the building. Someone else has another vision of the building. So here's this sense that fragmentation, the breakage of classification, the breakage of language, the failure of language to communicate, it can be powerful in a literary way because it inspires in the reader more vigorous acts of interpretation. Now let's think about that again. If language is a system meant to describe the world, and if language is ultimately separate from the world and unable to describe that world with any accuracy, well, where does that put us? That puts us in a kind of prison house of language. We speak about a world that we cannot ultimately capture. Well, what if our constructions with this language, what if they break and fail? What does this do? This ultimately reveals to us that language is separate from the world. It ultimately reveals to us that we are kind of captured in language. This is a good thing because the only way to get outside of language is to break language, to shatter language, to push into what cannot be named, to push in what has not yet been named. And that's precisely what this novel is about to a great extent. The whale symbolizes not one thing or another, it symbolizes the inability of symbols to describe the whale. So it's very much a novel about representation, about how language fails to represent the world as it is. As long as we believe that language can represent the world, we will be trapped in a kind of self-contained world of ignorance. But if we can realize that language does not describe the world, then we can shatter the language, break through the language, and again extend into the unknown, the inscrutable, the strange. But there we might have experiences that the language itself will not allow us to have. So what is working in this cetological chapter is this idea, again, that language is a kind of conceptual map. And it's not ultimately an accurate conceptual map. But that's not a bad thing. And if we can show the ways that these conceptual maps can break by not finishing them, by not completing them, then we might push to something beyond language. Something that even though we can't name, we can feel and experience. Ishmael wants this. Ishmael's constantly trying to look beyond the symbols to what is beyond the symbol. Whereas Ahab's doing the opposite. He's constantly trying to fit the world into his language. He's trying to fit the world into his language. So we see in someone like Ahab the danger of believing in the power of language to describe the world. We see in Ishmael the liberation of someone who is skeptical of language's ability to describe the world and is therefore willing to break language, to shatter language, to bend language, to torque language, and see what will happen.